The judge gave Douglas Mercer the house, the cars, and most of the retirement money before anyone mentioned the cabin. Marianne Mercer sat at the end of the counsel table with both hands folded over a legal pad she had never written on. She was 63, married for 38 years, and learning how efficiently a life could be converted into categories on a court form. Her attorney from a low-cost family law clinic had met her twice and kept glancing at the clock. Across the aisle, Douglas had a senior attorney, a junior associate, and Paige Lawson beside him. Paige was 32 and wore a pale gold dress that looked designed to be noticed without appearing to ask for attention. Her hand rested lightly on Douglas's sleeve whenever the judge looked their way. Marianne noticed the gesture and then forced herself to stop noticing. She was wearing a navy blazer she had bought for her daughter Claire's college graduation almost 20 years earlier. The blazer still fit, which felt like a strange fact to discover on the morning her marriage ended. The court approved the property division and 5 years of spousal support. Douglas kept the suburban house outside Helena, where they had raised Claire, along with the newer vehicles and the larger share of the retirement accounts. Marianne heard the terms without reacting. Then Douglas's attorney opened one more folder. "There is one remaining parcel," he said. It was 14 acres in a remote valley 3 hours north with an abandoned log structure and no active utilities. The county's last inspection had been decades earlier, and the structure had been marked uninhabitable. Douglas's attorney called the transfer a voluntary concession. Marianne looked across the aisle for the first time. Douglas gave the attorney a small, satisfied smile. It was not cruel enough to challenge and not innocent enough to misunderstand. The clerk slid a deed toward Marianne. The property had no street address, only a legal description, coordinates, and an old county notation about the cabin. She ran one finger over the paper as if the texture might explain why Douglas wanted her to have it. It did not. The judge asked whether she understood the order. "Yes," Marianne said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. When the hearing ended, she folded the deed into thirds and put it inside her coat. She left without looking at Douglas or Paige again. Outside, November light flattened the courthouse parking lot into gray pavement and bare trees. Marianne sat in her 12-year-old sedan with the engine off until almost every other car had left. The deed lay across her knees. 38 years had become a few pages in a file, and her final piece of property was 14 acres nobody wanted. She did not cry there. She simply sat until the windshield began to fog from her breath. Then she unfolded the deed again and found the coordinates. 3 hours north. She could go to Claire's guest room that afternoon. Claire had already told her the bathroom was private and the door could stay closed as long as Marianne wanted. Or she could drive to the land Douglas had given away because he believed its only value was as an insult. Marianne started the car. She drove north with the radio off. 40 minutes later, the highway carried her through the small town of Bellwether. The cafe where she and Douglas had eaten on Sundays during the first years of their marriage was still on the corner. The curtains were different, but the front windows were the same broad panes she remembered from 1986. For one reckless second, she remembered Douglas sliding a mug toward her and guessing 2 sugars, no cream. He had grinned when he got it right. She had been 29 and had thought with no fear at all that she could grow old beside him. Marianne eased off the accelerator. She did not stop. The hardest part of the divorce was not believing Douglas had always been false. It was remembering that there had once been a version of him worth trusting. She had not been foolish every day of those 38 years. Some years had been good. Some choices had been mutual. That truth hurt more than any clean story about betrayal would have. Her phone rang a little after noon. Claire's name appeared on the dashboard screen. Marianne answered. "Mom, please tell me you're headed here." Claire's voice had the careful calm she used when trying not to sound frightened. "I haven't decided where I'm staying tonight," Marianne said. "My guest room is not charity." "I know. You don't have to prove anything to Dad." Marianne watched the road climb toward the first low ridges. "This isn't about proving anything to him." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Then what is it about?" Marianne looked at the folded deed on the passenger seat. "I don't know yet." Claire exhaled slowly. "Call me when you do know." "I will." The next turn for Claire's neighborhood came and went 40 miles behind her. By mid-afternoon, pavement had become gravel. An hour after that, the gravel narrowed into a rutted Forest Service road and then a private track. Her phone lost service completely. She had printed directions the night before because uncertainty had made her practical. At the last junction, a rusted metal sign leaned between 2 posts. Mercer property was stamped across the top with no trespassing below it. Marianne stopped long enough to read her married name in rusted steel. For most of her adult life, Mercer had meant family, signatures, school form, tax return, and Christmas cards. Now it meant a warning at the edge of a road. She drove past the sign. The smell reached her before the cabin came fully into view. Wet pine, old animal nests, and timber that had absorbed too many seasons without drying. The track ended in a clearing where the cabin leaned slightly downhill. Part of the porch roof had collapsed. Two windows were missing their glass, and vines had entered through one frame as if the forest had begun reclaiming the interior. Marianne shut off the engine and stayed behind the wheel for almost a minute. Douglas had not exaggerated. The place was close to a ruin. She stepped out and pulled her coat tighter. The first porch board held. The second flexed under her boot. The third made a soft cracking sound that stopped her before she put her full weight on it. Marianne crossed with one hand against the outer wall. The front door dragged over the floor when she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of mold, wet wood, and years without heat. Late sunlight entered through a hole in the roof and landed on a collapsed section of interior wall. A squirrel or something similar moved somewhere in the back room. Marianne decided not to investigate. She stood in the doorway until the absurdity of the situation became completely clear. She was 63 years old, newly divorced, and considering sleeping in a condemned cabin in November. Then she looked back at the car. There was nowhere inside it that felt more like home. Before dark, she carried in a sleeping bag, a camping stove, 2 bins of supply, work gloves, batteries, and a small toolbox. She had stopped at a hardware store in Pine Crossing after realizing the directions were taking her farther from any hotel. She also brought in one framed photograph of Claire turning toward her in a graduation crowd, laughing at something outside the picture. That was the only photograph Marianne had taken from the house. She found a dry patch of floor near the stone fireplace and tested the flue with a handful of broken porch wood. The smoke rose cleanly. It was the first useful thing the cabin gave her. By 9, cold had entered from every direction. It came through the missing windows, the broken chinking, the roof, and the floorboards. Marianne lay fully dressed inside the sleeping bag and listened to the cabin contract around her. She had brought a novel. She never opened it. Sometime after midnight, the batteries in her flashlight died. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room almost completely black. Marianne lay awake and understood that no one could see her now. No judge, no daughter, no husband, no young woman in a gold dress. There was nothing left to perform. The tears came quietly and steadily. She did not argue with them. She cried for the house, for the marriage, for the plans that had once been reasonable, and for the woman who had believed those plans. When the crying stopped, the room remained dark and cold. Nothing had changed. Marianne lay there a while longer. Then a practical thought arrived with no ceremony. The rotten floor by the east wall has to come up first. She held that thought until it became more solid than the grief. At dawn, gray light entered through the hole in the roof. Marianne sat up with stiff fingers and an aching back. Daylight made the cabin look worse. It also made the east wall visible. She pulled on her gloves, crouched beside the softest floorboard, and worked her fingers under one end. The wood came apart in her hands. Marianne carried the pieces outside and threw them into the clearing. Then she went back for the next board. By the 4th morning, Marianne had a routine she refused to call a routine. Coffee came first, brewed on the camping stove and carried to the one porch step she trusted. She sat there while the light reached the trees and decided what she could finish before dark. Then she started. The work was not graceful. She watched repair videos whenever she could get a signal and wrote measurements on scrap cardboard. She learned the order of operations because every mistake cost either money or daylight. First she cleared debris. Then she opened damaged sections far enough to see what was actually wrong. Then she cleaned what could be saved and marked what had to be replaced. The floor near the east wall was worse than it looked. 2 joists had softened from years of moisture, and one section of subfloor had nearly dissolved. The roof leak above it had stained 3 wall logs and carried mold into the corner. Marianne spent an entire afternoon removing ruined material and ended the day with nothing that looked improved. That was the first lesson the cabin taught her. Progress did not always look like addition. Sometimes it looked like a larger whole and a clearer understanding of the problem. Her palms blistered during the first week. By the second, the skin had begun to toughen. She noticed while wrapping both hands around a coffee mug one cold morning. The ceramic no longer hurt against the healing spots. Marianne did not think of that as becoming stronger. She thought of it as her hands learning what her life required now. Claire called almost every day once service returned near the porch. On the sixth day, she stopped trying to sound calm. I checked the winter averages up there, Claire said. That valley can drop into the teens for days. I noticed the cold. Do you have insulation? Some. Working heat. A fireplace and a camping stove. Marianne scraped mold from a wall log with a putty knife. I know. You say that like knowing changes the temperature. It changes what I buy next. Claire did not laugh. I just need to know you're safe. Marianne lowered the scraper. She could hear fear beneath her daughter's impatience. I'm working, she said. That is as close to safe as I know how to feel right now. After the call, she stood still for several seconds. Claire was not wrong. Marianne had priced insulation, replacement windows, and a proper wood stove. The total was more than she could spend immediately. She had enough cash for the next repair, not every repair. The distinction mattered, so she kept making the next one. Late that afternoon, she moved from the east wall to a narrow partition beside what had once been a pantry. The logs there were different from the rest. They were slightly smaller, drier, and darker with age. The mold was lighter, which did not make sense given the damage around them. Marianne scraped one section clean and tapped it with her knuckles. The sound was dense. She moved 6 inches and tapped again. The second sound was hollow. She tried both places once more. Solid, hollow. Marianne set down the scraper. There should not have been empty space inside that wall. She took the flashlight from the sill and examined the seams between the logs. Someone had built the partition intentionally. The workmanship was old but careful. Marianne looked at the fading afternoon light. Then she looked across the room at the crowbar. She almost waited until morning. Instead, she picked it up. The first attempt did nothing. The second loosened a strip of dried chinking. On the third, the edge of one log shifted toward her with a soft wooden groan. Marianne worked slowly along the seam. She did not want to destroy more than she had to. When the first log came free, darkness appeared behind it. The opening was too deep to be a normal wall cavity. She removed a second log, then a third. The hidden space extended from floor to ceiling and ran almost the full length of the partition. It was narrow, perhaps 2 feet deep, like a room built only to be forgotten. Marianne aimed the flashlight inside. The cavity was empty except for one object centered on the floor, a cedar. It was about the size of a large shoebox with tight corners and a brass latch. The surrounding wood bore decades of stains and temperature damage. The cedar did not. Someone had chosen the material because they expected it to last. Marianne crouched and reached both arms into the opening. The box was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the section of floor she had already rebuilt and sat beside it. For several minutes, she did nothing. The cabin was quiet except for wind moving under the eaves. Douglas had called this place worthless. Marianne had almost believed him because the roof leaked and the floor had failed. But someone had once hidden something here with extraordinary care. That did not make the contents valuable. It made them intentional. She unhooked the brass latch. The hinge resisted, then opened. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, a small cloth, a sealed glass vial, and a folded survey map. Marianne lifted the oilcloth bundle first. The paper inside was dry. She unfolded the top document under the flashlight. It was a land office filing dated 1879. The paper recorded a joint claim connected to a mineral spring on the northern slope of the property. 2 names appeared at the bottom. Silas Mercer was listed first. Mabel Avery was listed as co-claimant. Marianne read the names again. The Mercer name tied the record to Douglas's family line. Mabel Avery's name meant nothing to her. The next pages included hand-drawn engineering sketches for a modest bathhouse. There were measurements, water flow notes, timber estimates, and letters from potential backers elsewhere in Montana. The survey map showed the cabin, the north slope, and a spring location marked in careful pencil. Several annotations were written in a smaller hand than the main survey notes. At the bottom of the box, Marianne found a separate folded sheet. The message was short. Late season, ground materials ordered, we start in spring. 2 sets of initials appeared beneath it. SM. Marianne held the note between both hands. No bathhouse had ever been built. No spring appeared on the modern county property sheet. Whatever Silas Mercer and Mabel Avery had intended in 1879 had stopped before the first foundation was dug. The cloth pouch contained small mineral samples with handwritten labels. The glass vial held a dark amber liquid behind an old wax seal. Marianne lifted it toward the flashlight. If the records were accurate, it could have been water from the spring. She set it down carefully. Then she returned to the joint claim. Mabel Avery's signature was smaller than Silas Mercer's, but more deliberate. The ink had faded almost to brown. The letters were still clear. Marianne traced the air above the name without touching the paper. A woman had signed a property claim in 1879 and left enough technical notes to prove she had done real work on the project. Yet Marianne had never heard of her. She looked around the half-repaired cabin. The box had been sealed inside a wall for more than a century. Marianne was the person who had opened it because a rotten floor had given her something to do after a night she thought would break her. She did not call Claire. She did not call Douglas. She spent the rest of the evening placing each document back in order and copying the visible dates into a notebook. For the first time since the divorce hearing, tomorrow felt like something other than a problem waiting for her. The old survey used chains and links instead of modern coordinates. Marianne had learned enough by then to distrust the first answer she got from anything old. She photographed every page and drove into Pine Crossing that evening. The nearest dependable Wi-Fi belonged to Marlowe's Cafe, a narrow place beside a feed store and a laundromat. Marianne took a back booth with her laptop, the survey, a yellow legal pad, and a pencil. The owner, Ruth Marlowe, brought coffee without asking many questions. Ruth was somewhere in her late 60s, with gray hair cut close and the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years around tired people. She glanced once at the old map. "Need a refill? Raise a hand," she said. That was all. Marianne converted the measurements 3 times. She cross-checked the property corners against the modern county parcel map and then compared the slope descriptions. The numbers put the spring roughly 200 yards northeast of the cabin. The next morning, she hiked out with the survey folded inside a plastic sleeve. She found nothing. The ground was frozen, the trees were too dense, and every rock seemed capable of becoming the landmark she wanted. Marianne walked the area twice before admitting she was wrong. Back at Marlowe's that evening, she found the error. She had copied a 9 as a 6 in the second conversion. Ruth topped off her mug while Marianne stared at the corrected line. "Bad number," Ruth asked. "One bad number in the wrong place." Ruth nodded as if that explained half of life. "Those are the expensive ones." Marianne smiled before she could stop herself. It was the first time she had done that in days. She returned to the slope on Friday. The corrected location brought her closer. In one patch, the frozen ground gave slightly beneath her boots. She marked the spot with a strip of orange surf tree and searched until dusk. Still no spring. By January, snow covered most of the property. Marianne had replaced 2 windows, patched the worst roof opening, and installed a used wood stove with help from a local chimney contractor. The cabin was not comfortable. It had become survivable. She kept the old documents in a fireproof lockbox whenever she was not working with them. On a Saturday morning after a fresh snowfall, she returned to the marked slope before breakfast. The snow told her what the map had not. Most of the hillside carried an even white layer. One roughly circular patch was thinner, not bare, just thinner by enough to look wrong. Marianne crouched inside the circle and pressed one gloved hand against the snow. She pulled off the glove and tried again. The surface was still cold, but less cold than the snow around it. She scraped away several inches. The soil underneath was firm at first and then unexpectedly soft. Marianne dug with a small camp shovel. At 6 inches, the soil grew damp. At 9, water began to gather at the bottom of the hole. She touched it with 2 fingers. Warm. Marianne sat back on her heels. A faint thread of steam disappeared into the winter air. She put her whole hand into the shallow water. The warmth moved between her fingers and against her wrist. The water smelled faintly metallic with a trace of sulfur. She did not cheer. She did not even reach for her phone. She stayed there with one hand in the ground and listened to the pines. The spring had continued moving under this hillside through every year the cabin stood empty. It had been there while Silas Mercer died and while Mabel Avery vanished from the local story. It had been there during Marianne's marriage, her daughter's childhood, and the morning a judge signed her divorce decree. None of those events had mattered to the water. Marianne reached into her coat and removed the old sealed vial. She had carried it with her every time she searched the slope. She placed it on the snow beside the hole. Old water and new water sat inches apart, separated by nearly a century and a half. That was when Marianne believed the records completely. Not because paper said the spring existed, because the ground did. She spent the next several weeks doing 2 kinds of work. During daylight, she repaired the cabin. At night, she learned what could be learned about old land records, groundwater testing, small commercial bathhouses, and permitting. She did not assume the 1,879 claims about therapeutic value were scientifically meaningful today. She knew old people had called many things medicinal because they wanted them to be. What mattered first was that the spring existed and flowed warm through winter. She arranged for a water sample to be tested before she allowed herself to imagine anything larger. The report confirmed elevated mineral content and no immediate red flags in the basic panel she ordered. It did not promise healing. It did tell her she was dealing with a real mineral spring rather than a story sealed in cedar. That distinction was enough. Marianne sketched a small bathhouse at the table she had built from salvaged interior timber. She kept Silas and Mabel's original drawings beside her but did not copy them. Codes had changed. Drainage expectations had changed. What had not changed was the logic of the location. The original builders had understood where the slope leveled, where runoff moved, and how the spring could be reached without cutting deeply into the hillside. Their plan had never been finished. Marianne began to wonder whether unfinished was the same thing as lost. 3 months after the divorce, a certified letter arrived through the county recorder's forwarding address. Marianne left it unopened on the table for almost an hour. Then she cut the envelope with a utility knife. The letter came from an attorney representing Helen Avery of Bozeman. Helen was 61 and had spent years researching her family's local history. Her attorney had found the 1,879 joint claim after a recent records inquiry connected to Mabel Avery. The claim had never been followed by a recorded release from Mabel or any later instrument clearly extinguishing her stated interest. The attorney did not pretend that meant Helen automatically owned half the property. He did argue that the unresolved record created a legitimate title dispute. His proposed resolution was blunt. Marianne could negotiate compensation for the asserted Avery interest or agree to a jointly managed sale process. Otherwise, Helen was prepared to ask a court to determine the old interest and its effect on the modern title. The response deadline was 72 hours. Marianne read the letter twice. Then she looked through the repaired window toward the north slope. For 3 months, the property had been the first thing in years that felt unquestionably hers to work on. Now a woman she had never met had a name attached to half its oldest recorded promise. Marianne drove to the county seat the following morning. Curtis Bell's law office occupied the second floor above a family-owned hardware store. He was 68, mostly retired, and had spent enough decades practicing in rural Montana to distrust easy answers about old land. Curtis read the attorney's letter once without speaking. Then he asked to see copies of the 1,879 documents. Marianne slid the folder across his desk. He read those more slowly. Finally, he leaned back. "This is not a clean 50-50 ownership claim," he said. Marianne waited. "But it isn't nonsense either." Curtis tapped the old filing with one finger. "The chain of title has a question in it, and questions like this become expensive when people decide only a judge can answer them." "How expensive?" "More than you want." "How long?" "Could be well over a year, longer if either side appeals or the historical record gets messy." Marianne looked out his window at a man loading lumber into a pickup below. "One board at a time. If I fight, can I?" Curtis's expression did not change. "Yes." "And can I lose?" "Yes." She appreciated that he did not decorate either answer. Curtis explained that litigation could also cloud any financing she might seek for the property. Even a defensible title position had practical costs while unresolved. Marianne folded her hand. "Would you fight it?" He considered that longer than she expected. "I'd first decide whether the person on the other side wants the same thing her lawyer is asking for." Marianne looked at him. "That is not legal advice," he added. "No," she said. "Sounds more useful than legal advice." Curtis almost smiled. Marianne paid the consultation fee and drove back to the cabin. The attorney's letter sat on her table that afternoon beside Mabel Avery's signature. Marianne took out a blank sheet of paper. She did not open her laptop. She began writing by hand. Marianne did not write a legal response. She wrote to Helen Avery. She described the hidden wall, the cedar box, and the documents still dry inside their oilcloth. She described the bathhouse drawings and the small survey notes written in Mabel's hand. She described finding warm water under January snow. Then she stopped and reread what she had written. The page sounded too much like a defense. Marianne crossed out the last paragraph and started again. "Your ancestor believed this place was worth building around," she wrote. "Her name is on the claim and her work is in the margins. I don't know why the project stopped, and I don't know why her interest disappeared from the later records. But before either of us turns this into a fight over value, I think you should see what she saw. Come here before we decide what the property is worth or what either of us is owed." Marianne signed her name and folded the letter. She did not send a copy to Curtis for approval. She drove it to the post office herself. For the rest of the 72 hours, she kept working. Waiting felt too much like the months before the divorce, when every important decision seemed to belong to someone else. The north wall needed new chinking. The porch railing needed 2 replacement posts. The spring needed a temporary cover to keep debris out of the test area. Those were things she could do. Helen Avery arrived 4 days later in a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked rear bumper. Marianne was resealing a window frame when the car appeared at the end of the track. She set down the caulking gun and watched from the porch. Helen parked carefully and remained behind the wheel for several seconds. When she stepped out, she did not look at Marianne first. She looked at the cabin, the repaired roofline, the glass in the windows, the stacked firewood under the lean-to, the cleared porch and the fresh chinking between the logs. The place no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied by effort. Helen closed the car door. She was broad-shouldered, dressed in worn hiking boots and a canvas jacket with a public library patch over one pocket. No attorney came with her. No briefcase did either. She walked toward Marianne and stopped at the foot of the porch. "You said Mabel's handwriting is readable." "It is," Marianne said. "Come inside." The cedar box was already open on the table. Marianne had placed the documents in the order she found them. She made coffee while Helen stood over the table without touching anything. When Marianne sat down, she nodded toward the papers. Helen picked up the joint claim first. She read it slowly. Then she moved to the survey and stared at the small annotations along the margins. For several minutes, the cabin held only the sound of paper moving. Helen finally touched one pencil note with the edge of her finger. She was a surveyor's assistant, she said. "I found payroll records from the county land office." Marianne listened. Mabel worked there from 1876 into the early 1880s. "I knew she helped with field measurements." Helen looked at the claim again. "I never knew she put her own name on a property filing." Her voice tightened slightly. "I never knew she had a stake in anything." Marianne showed her the engineering sketches. Helen recognized the handwriting on several measurements. "My grandmother used to say Mabel could calculate distances faster than the men she worked for." "Did your family know about the spring?" "No." Helen gave a small, almost embarrassed shake of her head. "We knew she had worked in this area. That was about it." She picked up the short note about building in spring. The page shook once in her hand before she steadied it. "She lived another 60 years, Helen said. "According to everything I've found, she never mentioned this project publicly again." Marianne understood that silence better than she wanted to. Not every silence came from having nothing to say. Sometimes a person learned that speaking cost more than staying quiet. Marianne did not turn that thought into a theory about a woman dead for generations. The records did not tell her enough. They only showed that Mabel had worked, signed, planned, and then vanished from the visible story. "There is something else," Marianne said. She took Helen to the north slope in late afternoon. The temperature had dropped, and the water's faint vapor was easier to see against the dark trees. Helen noticed it before Marianne pointed. She stopped walking. For a moment she simply watched the air above the spring move. They approached together. Marianne had widened the original hole and stabilized the edges with temporary timber. The water flowed steadily through gravel and stone. Helen crouched and held one hand above it. Then she touched the surface. Her face changed, not dramatically. The change was smaller and more convincing than that. Recognition replaced suspicion. "Mabel measured this," Helen said. "Yes." She knew it was here. "Yes." Helen sat back on her heels. The mineral smell rose around them. "I came because my lawyer said I might have a claim worth money." Marianne said nothing. "I don't think that's what I want." Helen looked across the slope toward the cabin. "I want her name to exist somewhere outside a box." Marianne felt the answer before she said it. "It will." Helen looked up. "Where?" "On the sign." "What sign?" "The one I haven't built yet." Marianne crouched beside her. "If this place becomes anything, the history belongs to both names." Helen studied her face. "You would put Mabel's name on it, even if I signed away the claim?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because she was there." The answer came without strategy. Marianne had already written Mabel Avery's name into the margin of her own bathhouse sketches weeks earlier. She had never thought of the choice as generosity. It was accuracy. Helen turned back to the water. What would the sign say? Marianne pictured the wording she had been testing in her notebook. Alder Ridge Mineral Spring, first claimed in 1879 by Silas Mercer and Mabel Avery, restored in 2024. Helen's eyes stayed on the spring. Same sign, no footnote, no smaller letters, no suggestion that one person's name mattered less because history had printed it less often. Helen pressed her palm flat against the warm water again. "She would have wanted that," she said. Marianne did not answer for Mabel. She had no right. They stayed at the spring until the light weakened between the trees. After the visit, Curtis and Helen's attorney put the women's understanding into a short written settlement. Helen withdrew the demand for money or a forced sale, and Marianne committed to preserve Mabel's equal historical credit at the site. The old title question stopped being a weapon between them. No judge decided who had been morally right in 1879. Two women in the present decided that recognizing Mabel's work mattered more than turning her name into another fight. Claire arrived without warning in late March. Marianne was on a ladder fastening a strip of metal flashing beneath the repaired north eave. She heard tires on gravel and looked down. Claire's rental car came around the final bend and stopped slightly crooked beside the clearing. She had parked that way since she was 17. Marianne stayed on the ladder for a moment longer than necessary. Claire got out and stared at the cabin. She had last seen photographs from Marianne's first week there. Those pictures had shown broken windows, exposed floor joists, and blue tarps over the roof. Now the porch stood level. Every window held glass. The exterior logs were cleaned, sealed, and rechinked. A simple garden bed ran along the south wall, still empty in the cold but ready for spring. Claire looked up at her mother. "Are you planning to come down? I was considering making you climb up." Claire's mouth moved as if she had almost smiled. Marianne climbed down. They stood a few feet apart in the clearing. Claire had driven almost 9 hours from her home in eastern Washington. She wore work boots and a dark jacket, and she looked tired enough that Marianne did not ask whether she had slept. Instead, Marianne hugged her. Claire held on longer than either of them expected. That evening, Marianne made soup on the propane range she had installed beside the restored kitchen wall. Claire sat at the table made from salvaged cabin timber and ran her fingertips along one edge. The surface was not perfectly smooth. Marianne had left 2 shallow saw marks because removing them would have made the board too thin. "Mom," Claire said. Marianne kept stirring. "I told you this place was impossible." Marianne looked over her shoulder. Claire's eyes were on the table, not on her. "I was wrong." 3 words. No long apology. No explanation about worry or good intentions. Marianne turned off the burner and carried the pot to the table. "Thank you," she said. They ate without trying to resolve the rest. The cabin was warm enough that neither woman wore a coat indoors. That fact alone would have seemed impossible 4 months earlier. After dinner, Marianne brought out the cedar box. She told Claire about Mabel Avery, Helen's visit, and the agreement they had signed. Then she took out her bathhouse sketches. Claire's posture changed immediately. She was an architect, and professional curiosity displaced family worry within seconds. "Where are you putting the drain field?" she asked. "I knew you were going to start there. Because water has to leave after it arrives." Marianne slid a second sketch across the table. Claire studied it. "Have you had someone look at frost depth and slope stability?" "Not yet. You need that before you pour anything." "I assumed." Claire looked up. "You assumed correctly." Marianne laughed. It felt easy. That was new. They spent the next hour talking about the practical problems instead of whether Marianne should be solving them. Claire asked about ventilation, accessibility, water storage, freeze protection, and emergency shutoff. Marianne answered what she knew. When she did not know, she said so. Claire wrote those questions in a pocket notebook. Around 10, the stove settled into a low, steady burn. Marianne added 1 log and sat back down. "There is something I haven't told anyone," she said. Claire stopped writing. "I stopped thinking about your father every hour somewhere around the 3rd week." Claire's expression softened. Marianne looked toward the east window. "I still thought about what happened. I still got angry." She rubbed one thumb over a small scar on her palm. "But there was too much work here for him to stay at the center of it." Claire closed the notebook. "Was that why you kept going?" "No." Marianne surprised herself with how quickly she answered. "I kept going because the work was mine." She looked around the room. "Every repaired section in here exists because I chose the next thing and did it." Claire's eyes filled, but she did not interrupt. "I thought I was rebuilding a place because I had nowhere else to go," Marianne said. "Then I realized the place gave me somewhere to go every morning." Claire looked down at the table. The silence between them did not feel like distance. It felt like rest. After a while, Claire opened the notebook again. "Show me the first bathhouse sketch." Marianne did. Claire slept in the loft that night. Before she left, she wrote down practical questions about drainage, freeze depth, ventilation, and load-bearing points. Marianne kept the notes. Over the following months, the bathhouse moved from sketches to actual work. Marianne kept it small because the old plans had been small and because the site did not need a monument. 3 soaking rooms would face the trees. A simple changing area would hold benches and a wood stove. Claire sent more notes about drainage, and Marianne worked through them with the people helping her build. The less decorative the project became, the more it seemed to belong to the valley. By fall, the bathhouse stood below the north slope, practical and quiet against the trees. The spring water fed the soaking rooms at its natural warmth. Marianne made the sign herself from a length of clear pine she had saved from the cabin repairs. She practiced the routing on 2 scrapboards before carving the final one. The finished sign stood near the bathhouse path, Alder Ridge Mineral Spring. Below it were the words first claimed in 1879 by Silas Mercer and Mabel Avery. The final line read Restcord 2024. Mabel Avery's name was the same height and weight as Silas Mercer's. Helen came before opening day and stood in front of the sign without speaking. Marianne waited beside her. Helen finally touched 2 fingers to Mabel's carved surname. "Thank you," she said. Marianne shook her head. "You don't have to thank me for spelling the history correctly." Helen looked at her for a moment. "People leave women out correctly for generations," she said. Then she looked back at the sign. Marianne did not know what Mabel would have thought of any of it. She only knew the name was no longer hidden. Ruth Marlowe arrived at 9 on opening morning with a folded towel under one arm and a thermos under the other. She wore the same gray fleece jacket she used behind the counter at the cafe. Marianne met her outside the changing room. "You are early," Marianne said. "I am old enough to know early beats waiting in line." "There is no line." "Then my strategy worked." Ruth looked at the sign, then at the bathhouse. "Nice work." "Thank you." Marianne showed her the first soaking room. The cedar tub sat beneath a wide window facing the trees. Steam moved softly along the glass. The room smelled of clean wood and minerals instead of mildew and wet rot. Ruth set down her towel. "I'll tell you if the water is terrible. I appreciate the professional review." Ruth closed the door. A few seconds later, Marianne heard water running into the tub. She stood alone in the hallway and listened. No applause, no speech, no dramatic confirmation that the years before this had been leading somewhere. Just a door closing and a person using what she had built. Marianne leaned one shoulder against the wall. That ordinary sound moved her more than the inspection approval had. The place worked. Marianne stayed there until the water stopped running. The place was open. That evening she thought about Douglas for the first time in weeks. What surprised her was not anger but distance. He felt like someone she had once known closely in a life that had ended and led, by a road she never would have chosen, to this one. She did not imagine showing him the sign. She did not imagine explaining the spring. There was too much that belonged to her now without needing his reaction. One evening after the last guest left, Marianne walked through the cabin alone. She was not checking repairs. She knew every repair. She knew which window had required 3 attempts to square, which floorboard carried a knot near the stove, and which roof patch still needed watching after heavy rain. She walked slowly because the place had become familiar in her body. At the east wall, she placed her palm against the cleaned logs. That was where she had scraped mold during the first week. Marianne crossed to the first section of floor she had repaired. She crouched and pressed her hand flat against one board. The wood held the room's heat. She remembered the night the flashlight died. She remembered lying in the dark with no plan beyond morning. Then she remembered the single thought that came after the crying stopped. The floor by the east wall has to come up first. At the time, the thought had seemed almost insultingly small. It had not solved the divorce. It had not restored her savings or changed Douglas's choices. It had given her one action she could complete. That had been enough to create the next action. Marianne stood outside. The spring continued running in the dark. She turned off the cabin lamp and went to bed. The following spring, Claire returned on a Saturday without calling first. Snow had disappeared from the south-facing ground but still held in shaded pockets beneath the pines. Marianne was kneeling beside the front porch with a hammer and pry bar. One original step remained. Everything above it and below it had been replaced. The step had survived because Marianne kept finding more urgent work. She had also begun to suspect she was saving it for a reason she could not name. Claire stopped at the bottom of the porch. She looked at the weathered step. Then she looked at the new board lying beside Marianne. "Can I do that one?" Marianne rested the hammer across her knee. Claire wore work gloves tucked into one back pocket. No notebook, no rolled drawing, no professional questions. Just her daughter standing on the gravel. Marianne held out the hammer. Claire took it and crouched beside the step. She positioned the replacement board, set the first nail, and swung. The hammer struck wood beside the nail head. A small dent appeared in the fresh surface. Claire winced. Marianne said nothing. Claire adjusted her grip and tried again. The second strike landed cleanly. The next two drove the nail flush. She moved to the other end and repeated the process. 4 minutes later, the final original step was gone. The new one sat level between the stringers. The first dent remained beside the nail. Claire stood and placed the hammer on the porch railing. She did not hand it back. She set it down as if she expected to use it again. Marianne noticed. Neither woman mentioned it. Marianne stepped onto the new board with her full weight. It held without movement. Claire watched her. Solid? Marianne shifted once from heel to toe. Solid. She stepped off the porch and started toward the tree line. Morning light came between the pines at a low angle. The air still carried winter in the shade, but the exposed ground had begun to soften. Behind her, Claire remained on the porch for a few seconds. Then Marianne heard her boots on the new step. She did not turn around. The sound was enough. Up the slope, the mineral spring moved warm through stone and soil, as it had long before Marianne knew the valley existed. It had outlasted abandoned plans, missing names, 30 years of neglect, and one marriage ending badly. Marianne walked toward the spring while Claire's footsteps followed at an unhurried distance behind her. The path was damp with thaw. The trees were opening to morning light, and the ground beneath them was still warm. The spring was not a reward for surviving a bad marriage, and the cabin was not proof that every loss hides a fortune. What mattered was what each person chose once the truth in front of them became harder to ignore. Marianne's first useful choice had come before the cedar box, before the spring, and before anyone believed the property had value. She saw a rotten board that could no longer carry weight, and she removed it. That practical act became a useful way to understand the rest of her life. Some damaged things deserve patient repair. Other things become dangerous when we keep standing on them because they once supported us. Knowing the difference is more important than pretending every relationship, plan, or institution can be restored to its earlier shape. Marianne also learned that acknowledging a marriage's good years did not excuse the way it ended. Douglas's later choices did not require her to insult the younger woman who had once trusted him. A painful ending can change the future without rewriting every honest moment that came before it. Helen's decision raised a different question about rights and outcomes. She had enough historical evidence to create a costly legal fight, but a possible claim was not the same as a desired life. By speaking directly, the two women discovered that recognition mattered more to Helen than extracting cash from Marianne. That does not mean people should avoid courts when another party refuses fairness or when important rights need formal protection. It means legal leverage and human purpose are not always identical, and confusing them can make a conflict larger than its real need. Claire's change was quieter but equally important. Her fear first told her that helping meant getting her mother away from the cabin. Later, she learned to name the risks, offer expertise, and leave the decision with the adult whose life was actually being lived. Care becomes more respectful when it protects without automatically taking control. Marianne's rebuilding was not a simple story about determination defeating every obstacle. She had land, some financial support, access to professionals, a daughter with useful expertise, and extraordinary luck in what the property contained. Those advantages mattered, but none of them could make daily choices for her after the dramatic discoveries were over. The deeper change came when Douglas stopped being the audience for her future. She no longer needed him to regret the cabin, envy the bathhouse, or understand what his gesture had set in motion. The work became meaningful because it belonged to her, not because it proved him wrong. Starting over often looks smaller than the phrase suggests. Sometimes it begins with one damaged thing examined clearly, one decision made without applause, and one piece removed because it cannot safely bear weight anymore.